Hello everyone. Welcome to my presentation on Mexico. You may notice that I use a lot of videos and sources from non-academic articles written by Latinx folks. I want to preface that, like some students, I am a strong visual and kinetic learner than an auditory learner. Take some time to reflect on different learning styles and how you can incorporate different teaching tactics for these types of students. I find articles written by everyday people who grow up in these experiences more valid and easily relatable to those who are searching for more inner grounding work. Throughout our schooling so far, you may have noticed how I use the term Latinx to describe Spanish-speaking folks. The term Latinx is a recent term that gained popularity among Spanish speakers in the US. For it is an inclusive term that represents all groups of people without excluding non-binary folks or those who identify as more than one gender. I'm going to play this clip, for I believe it is important to acknowledge this term when referring to Spanish people who come from Latin American countries, as well as the Caribbean. This video is brought to you by Pero Light, a YouTube channel that explores many different cultures and issues through Latinx history. I implore you to check out their channel to learn more about Latinx culture and history.
Latinx. People have feelings. So many feelings, in fact, that whenever the Pero Like team uses the term Latinx in a post or video, the comment section is invariably devoted to some heated discussion about the term. Some people love it, some people hate it. Some people just don't care and want to get back to leaving inappropriate comments about Gadiel. I'm looking at you. Either way, there's some strong opinions out there. So let's talk about it. Let's dissect the X.
Why would you do that with your hands? Why would you overcomplicate this? All you had to do was say Latinx and just sit there. Just look at when your mom doesn't pick up your calls.
Let's dissect the X.
Nailed it.
Latinx is a term widely used amongst professors, activists, and journalists. It was coined in the last few decades, supposedly in 2004 by the LGBT community, but it didn't really gain traction until around 2015 when Tumblr and Twitter pushed the term into popularity. So why Latinx? Well, the Spanish language is gendered. Most nouns are either considered masculine or feminine, and more often than not, the language supports a dynamic where the masculine has a higher status than the feminine. For example, a group of women are called Latinas, but if one man joins the situation, suddenly the group is now called Latinos, which is just one example of how the language has an inherent preference for masculine over feminine. Latinx challenges this patriarchal language structure and helps dismantle binaries. It's an important term for people who don't identify as either male or female. It's inclusive, it's affirming, and it says you don't have to identify as solely male or Latino to be valued and recognized by your language. Now, some people do take issue with Latinx. They think it seeks to dismantle too much of our past and culture. We start putting X's places, what's going to happen to the rest of the language? Or maybe you are non-binary, but you don't think the term serves as a really good identifier for you. But what do I know? Let's talk to somebody who strongly identifies as Latinx about why the term is important to them.
Of course, hi. I identify with Latinx very strongly because it leaves space for folks who are non-binary and a little more fluid in their gender identity.
The Spanish language does unite Latinos. We are very proud of the language, and yet for most people residing in South or Latin America, this language is an imposed language. It came from Spain. It's a Western language that was gendered and sort of brought onto cultures that perhaps, like you said, had a third gender or weren't so rooted in masculine and feminine.
I feel an own disconnect with my indigenous roots in Mayan and Aztec cultures. They were goddesses and gods that were bigender, and folks who brought in the Yoruba and Orishas.
How were you sort of introduced to the term?
Mostly through academic circles. I heard it mostly in undergrad with folks who were in Chicano studies and also in queer studies. Just seeing the term kind of evolve and really take off on a kind of viral mode. A lot of folks have been seeing it on social media. A lot of folks have been using it in at workplaces that work with Latinx communities. I work with a lot of nonprofits that kind of are adopting that term too.
We're sort of trying to find what fits right, and maybe it's not Latinx, but for right now, it feels like what is a good representation for non-binary and non-gender conforming, and maybe that will change.
I don't think that Latinx is perfect. I think for now it's kind of opening a dialogue, a discussion to maybe evolve to another term. But I feel that right now Latinx is kind of where a lot of folks feel comfortable with.
I think a lot of the fear that comes from Latinx is people thinking that we're trying to change the whole language and take the gendering out of the language and dismantle that and that history.
We don't want to impose that you have to adopt neutral language all the time. If you want to use she, her pronouns or he, him pronouns, you're still valid in your experience, and we don't want to say that you can't do that anymore. There are still a lot of trans folks who still live in the binary, who still want to be recognized as woman or man or masculine or feminine. So not to erase the other identifiers or the other terms, but rather to just have it visible, so folks understand what it is and what it means. I think it's okay to be complicated, it's okay to be questioning, it's okay to be figuring things out, because I feel like in life there isn't really a clear-cut route. If you ever feel that, you know, Latinx doesn't fit for you, that's more than okay. You're always welcome to kind of play around with labels until you feel that something fits.
So there you have it. Love it, hate it. If the term's for you, you get to decide whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, don't use it. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe just don't tell people that suddenly feel seen and heard by their language to not use it. Is that a crazy idea? I don't know. It's like a deal.
Not sure.
The term Hispanic is problematic. I really like this explanation on why the term Hispanic no longer functions as a way to identify groups of people. According to the article that's linked here and also down below in my sources, Hispanic has function and the power to whiten people, even though in practice, in their daily life, people might not be read as white or be identifying themselves as white in that particular way. Pierce says, explaining how the term can miss the nuance of an identity like Afro-Latinx by grouping it in with white Latinx people. So it erases people's mixed heritage, their families, their stories, by making people identify with the whiteness of Spain and the virtues of that particular term. The article was written in 2018 and it's still very much relevant. That's not to say that this term is recognized by all Latinx cultures and countries, but it is what I will use to identify groups of Spanish-speaking people who do not come from Spain.
Latinx.
Cultura de Mexico. Moving on to a little bit of background on Mexico. It is a country located below the United States and above Guatemala and Belize. These videos touch upon Mexican culture and its geography. To summarize, if you don't want to watch these videos to my left or to my right, Mexico has 31 states, but it also recognizes as having 32 federal entities due to Mexico City being large enough to be its own entity. Like the United States, Mexico has a diverse landscape consisting of mountain ranges, volcanoes, deserts, plains, and jungle. This diversity in landscape has also led to different regional foods like pozole, tortas, cabritos, and so forth. It's important to note that just because you are familiar with one dish from Mexico, a Mexican may not have ever heard or tried said dish. There is not much diversity in their demographics. Over 62% of Mexicans are mestizo, meaning they're a mixed percentage between indigenous people and Spanish Europeans. 21% identify as indigenous, while 10% identify as white. It's also important to note that there are Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Middle Eastern Mexicans as well, and their identities are consistently erased in these types of statistics. Though Spanish is the primary language in Mexico, with over 92% of people speaking it, Mexico does not have an official language. Neither does it have an official religion, although over 80% of people identify being Catholic that celebrates indigenous aspects. In this next slide, I define some cultural practices. These definitions not only apply to Mexicans, but also other folks in the Latinx community. I recommend watching the clip on machismo and chisme culture surrounding the Latinx community. I will talk about how LGBTQ+ members are treated in a later slide. As defined in the dictionary, machismo means having strong masculine pride. This has been a problematic effect on young Latinx men. Young Latinx boys are taught to be strong and to show no emotion while being the caretaker of the family. This can have an effect on how they show up in social settings like school. If a male identifying student finds themselves in trouble by a teacher or others, they're likely not to speak up for themselves and told to handle it like a man by showing no emotion. This causes masculine toxicity and can create aggression in young males where they have no other outlet to release their emotions. And this can also negatively impact women in the community. The other word that you see defined is chisme. Chisme is part of Latinx culture, and students as young as kindergartners are fully immersed in the practice. It is important to acknowledge that this exists and is a valid form of communication between families and students. There is no reason to shame students for cultural practice because it has been a way of life and a way to share information that can be pertinent to survival. When thinking about Latinx students in your school, how do you create strong SEL practices? These videos are also linked down below in my sources if you can't get them to play. I strongly recommend watching both of these, especially if you work with any Latinx population in your schools.
We have to acknowledge that
There has been a long history of migration from Mexico to the US since before the 21st century. This video goes over a brief overview of that history, although I do want to warn that there is a slur in this video that may be uncomfortable to some. While the biggest influx of immigration tends to be from Mexico, there has been a reduction in migration from Mexico in recent years. There is speculation that due to the recession in 2008, many Mexicans have been making the migration back. That's not to say that all migration has stopped. In fact, there are many reasons for people to migrate to the United States, as listed to my right. American dollars are highly valued and are worth more than pesos which is what Mexico uses for currency. Sometimes access to medicine and doctors are more plentiful in the US than in Mexico. Education is another big one. While bigger cities like Mexico City have schools from Head Start all the way to university, the same cannot be said about schools in pueblos or small towns outside of the city. Many students will go to elementary school, but if middle school is too far away in the next town or there is no transportation, then the student learning is halted and stops at the elementary level. The same applies to middle schoolers who have no access to high school. In the bottom 3 videos below, I have showcased the violence that affects families and children in Mexico. I do want to warn that these clips are violent and graphic and may not be comfortable for viewers. I decided to add these clips because children and parents can become desensitized to violence and speak about it openly with no idea how it may impact their peers around them. It's important to note that these are a few immigration stories and that there is not a monolithic story on why someone migrates to the US. These videos are also linked down below in my sources for you to check out if that is something you are interested in learning more about. The Seattle School District serves over 6,948 English language learners who contribute 154 languages spoken by families across the district according to SPS school website. At Concord International, over 46% of students receive ELL services. These services start with a home language survey that is filled out by the parent or guardian informing the family of the service. And if they like to be enrolled into if they like to enroll their students into said service. Not all families who have ELL children are enrolled in ELL services, which is a choice that's made by the family usually. If a student is enrolled, then they're given an assessment given entirely in English to see what supports they may need. After the assessment, they're put into categories leveled from 1 all the way to 4. 1 is needing the most support because the student does not know any or little English, to 4 being very fluent in English. We give students a yearly academic test in March called the ELPA that gathers data on how well they're thriving in English. If a student scores very well, they're recommended to exit the program. This puts them in the category 4, which they're monitored for a couple years after to ensure that they meet standards and are progressing well in English. A typical day for an ELL student at Concord on a single language side starts with SEL circles and then general courses throughout the day. ELL teachers and bilingual IAs will come into the classroom to support students with their academics. Some challenges that may arise may be lack of representation to the ELL students on the single language class. Language can also be a barrier at our school if the main language is neither English nor Spanish. Cultural differences on how students interact with staff is taken into accordance. On the dual side, students will learn general courses in both English and Spanish. We have fully contained classrooms in which students stay all day with their teachers and learn subjects in Spanish and others in English. In other classrooms, students will have two teachers, one who will teach in English, and then the students switch classrooms and learn from another teacher who teaches in Spanish. They're supported by ELL teachers and IAs who must be fluent in Spanish to support the dual language side. Here I have listed several sources that may be important to our Latinx community. The main one I want to focus on is El Centro de la Raza, meaning a center for all races. I'm going to play the next clip to describe what the organization is about and how they're expanding.
In October 1972, a group of visionary activists peacefully took over the vacant, dilapidated Beacon Hill Elementary School. In the early 1970s, Seattle's relatively small Latino population began to expand with new immigrants, some fleeing political persecution and some simply seeking a better life. The abrupt closure of the Chicano English and Adult Basic Education program at South Seattle Community College left many recent arrivals out in the cold, without a means of learning English, of integrating into a new society. Roberto Maestas, a local teacher and civil rights advocate, was one of the educators in that South Seattle program. Maestas and others led the 1972 occupation, which lasted for 3 months and ended with the city of Seattle finally leasing the building for $1 per year for the creation of a new community center, El Centro de la Raza, the Center for the People of All Races. The organization has grown into a major hub of social services and civil rights advocacy. Originally painted during the 1972 occupation and more recently restored and expanded, this mural was painted by Daniel DeSega, an artist originally from Walla Walla. It represents the blending of the Pacific Northwest and Mexican Aztec heritage, with references to farm workers' struggles and labor rights.
To save on time, I will leave this video as well as this one linked down below in my sources if that is something you're more interested in. Here are some of the services that El Centro de la Raza provides. I've also added their mission statement linked to their website down in my sources. Their mission, according to their website, is to seek and to serve and empower all whom we reach to learn from each other and unite our energies in the noble struggle for basic social change. The provision of a wide range of survival services alone is only temporarily relief for deep societal wounds. It does not address the root of poverty, discrimination, alienation, and despair. El Centro de la Raza strives to use social, cultural, educational, economic, and civic activities as vehicles to bring together people of all races and refuses to separate our nation's economic model from the historic tragedy of racism, poverty, and war. Our organization tries to combine a strong sense of self-worth and connectedness to one's family and cultures with active participation in the community affairs. Our collective self-governance has developed an extensive network locally, nationally, and internationally to join diverse people with common problems in search of effective and just solutions. These services are useful to our families because a lot of issues can arise from barriers in language and not knowing what services the city of Seattle can provide. I also want to talk about Colectiva Legal de Pueblo. It's a non-hierarchical collective organization founded for and by undocumented immigrants working to build community leadership and power for migrant justice through legal advocacy and education. And down here below, Puentes creates innovative therapeutic spaces to promote the recovery of social agency, social healing, and organize our communities towards collective immigration justice in the United States.
This is a big deal. Federal wage.
Earlier in a slide about Mexican culture, I talked about how over 80% of Mexicans are Catholic. Due to religious ties, it can be difficult to truly be yourself. The LGBT plus community in Mexico has faced many inequalities and homophobic threats and discrimination. Many are killed for simply identifying with their true self. I've been thinking about ways to support local students who identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And an idea I had for a family engagement is to host an open forum in my class for open discussion. A lot of the time, we see issues in our community of terrible things being done. And while it is easy to see why it is terrible, sometimes the hard part is asking why people are doing the terrible thing. In Mexico, there's not any exposure of LGBTQ plus folks in media, literature, government, and so forth. I do want to add that although it is changing now, this would not have been said a couple years ago. It is proven that the more exposure and education you receive on a topic, the more open-minded you become. I want to be able to create exposure and dialogue for parents to understand how to best support students who may identify as LGBTQ+. I would like to host events in my classroom where we have potlucks and families are welcome to bring whatever dish they want. We either read or view a platform that centers Latinx LGBTQ+ folks. We then have guest speakers, either an adult or student who is willing to speak on experiences and how they felt supported. Then we end with a discussion and an anonymous box where parents can drop questions for their next time we host an open forum. It's important to note that queer children exist, and if we want to educate all children, then we need to support all families and be willing to talk about these topics. This concludes my presentation on Mexico and the Latinx community. Here are my sources as well as additional sources linked throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to respond. Thank you.